Hello, church. Hope you're doing well. Hope things are going well with you this evening. It's kind of a rainy evening. We got some thunderstorms going through, but hopefully you're safe and warm and dry at the moment. We are in Matthew chapter 12, verses 38 through verse 50. We're finishing up this section of scripture. As you know, that we're in this middle section of the book. We will be finishing up more of the story section about his miracles and things that he did, his conflicts with the Pharisees and various people. And then starting Sunday, we will get into the parables about the kingdom. So the parable of the tares, the parable of the sower, all these parables of the kingdom. And they are a reflection of everything that we've talked about so far and the different responses that people have to the kingdom, to the king, to everything we're talking about here. And it'll be a microcosm of how the gospel of Jesus is responded to in the whole world and even today. And this is how people respond to it. So that's kind of where we are. Remember, in the previous sections, we looked at how John responded to him, how various cities respond to him, how some of the people respond to him. Lately in this chapter, though, in chapter 12, we specifically zoned in on how the Pharisees responded to him and how negatively they responded to him. Last week we talked about how they were accusing Jesus of doing these various miracles, especially the miracles he did on the Sabbath, doing them because he's the prince of demons, not because he's from God or he's the son of God or the son of David, as the people were saying, but because they called him the prince of demons. And Jesus totally destroys them in their logic and saying, you can't say that. And he lays out reason. And then he says, by what you say, by your fruit, you know how good the tree is, how good the heart is. And he's saying, because you said something that is clearly evil and clearly untrue, and you refuse to accept the truth, thus you show what your heart is, and it is not one of that will be part of the kingdom. And so that's kind of what we talked about. Now we're going to continue to follow this line, because in verse 38, the scribes and Pharisees are going to try to recover themselves and so recover some ground, because Jesus had just basically thrashed them. So verse 38, then some of the scribes and Pharisees answered him, saying, "Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you." But he answered them, "An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The men of Nineveh will rise up in judgment of this generation and condemn it. For they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and behold, something greater than Jonah is here. The queen of the south will rise up at the judgment of this generation and condemn it. For she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and behold, something greater than Solomon is here." Okay, so the Pharisees and scribes are seeking to justify themselves, seeking to make themselves look a little bit better in the eyes of the people. And he says, we're open to reason. If you could just show us a sign, then we will believe you. You just need to give us a sign. Now, Jesus had been giving signs all over the place. I mean, he healed multitudes. Like, he had cast out demons. He did all kinds of stuff. He healed the blind, which no one else could be able to do. That wasn't the problem. They wanted a sign that they expected, that fit them. They said, "Do what we want, and we will believe you. Do what we want you to do, and we will believe you." And this is the whole thing: is Jesus isn't the type of king that they were expecting. They were expecting someone to help them that would be full of Judean pride and get them out of the bondage of Rome. But instead, Jesus is a different kind of person. Instead of being all patriotic for the Jewish country, he is a spiritual king. He cares more about the hearts of men. both in Judea and in the Gentile nations as well, which does not sit well with them. And so he says, you're not going to see a sign. And it's just befuddling. I don't know what they expected to see that he had not already done yet. This also kind of shows that, there's people that you probably talk to, I've certainly talked to, where they say there's atheist or some kind of agnostic, and they say, well, if God really wanted me to believe him, then he would just come down. And, if he came to earth, then I would believe him. And the fact is, Jesus did come to earth, and he did all kinds of signs, and yet people did not believe him. Because you will believe what you want to believe, and that's the end of that. And there's nothing more that he can do or say to have you believe that. So that's just kind of how it is. But he does give kind of a prelude to a sign. He first says, adulterous, evil generation, you will not be given a sign. Because, and what he's saying there is there's going to be signs, but no sign that you will recognize, except for the sign of the prophet of Jonah. And what he's talking about is saying, basically, if you don't believe the sign of my resurrection, then there's nothing else left. Like, that is the most potent, that's the most powerful, the most awesome miracle sign that he is Jesus Christ. He conquered death, and he conquered it with himself. Like, he didn't need another person to raise him from the dead. He raised himself from the dead. And so that's why it's so powerful, is the doors of Hades and hell and death could not keep him. They could not keep Jesus. Nothing could keep Jesus down under death in the tomb. And so he says it will be that sign. And then he says that Jonah and Nineveh are assigned to this coming generation. If you go back and read Jonah, and I've done this recently, I taught a class about a month ago, I think, on it. It's a very interesting story. It's a little bit different than I remember, because I hadn't read it in quite a long time. And what you remember is mostly what you learned in kids' school and Sunday school growing up. And that's kind of a fanciful part of it. But if you look at Jonah, Jonah is prophesying to the Ninevites, part of the Syrian army area. And Jonah goes, and he doesn't want to do that at first, but he eventually goes, and 3 days he preaches to them, and then they repent. Everywhere from the king to the animals, they all sit in sackcloth and ashes, and they repent. And then you contrast that with the prophets of like Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and all these other prophets who for years, lifetimes, prophesied to the people of Israel over and over, and showed them great signs, and loved them and wanted nothing more than for them to be saved. And yet they didn't even listen. They would never listen. In fact, before appointing some of the prophets, God would tell them, yeah, no one's going to listen to you, but I still want you to prophesy. And that's the reason that Jonah is there. Jonah is against the Jewish people, saying, this is how you should have been. That these pagans in Nineveh, when they heard 3 days of words from God, from a guy who didn't like them, they repented. But you could have prophet after prophet, year after year, and know the power of God, have either lived through the power, some miraculous things, or heard about that, and yet they don't care. They never repented. They never turned back. They never did what they should have done. And that's really the point of it, is Jesus is a type of Jonah. He will be a type of Jonah. And the same thing is the Queen of South, the Queen of Sheba, which most people think is kind of in the Saudi Arabia, Yemen kind of area, modern day. That's where they think that she came from. And it said, the Queen of the South will rise up in judgment, and this generation condemn it. For she came to the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. So this Queen of Sheba came from a very far distance away, very far for people to travel on that day, especially. And she came all the way with the riches and gold and everything else because she heard the wisdom of Solomon and she wanted to behold it for herself. And yet, there's something greater than Solomon here. There's Jesus Christ, the Son of God. You have God in person. And yet they're not listening. And this is the kind of rejection that Jesus is facing from the people to the cities where he was, like Capernaum, to the scribes and the Pharisees, which were supposed to be the spiritual elite. He is rejected by all of them. And it's a great sense of apathy, and it's a great sense of just not caring. Okay, so and then he goes directly into this parable in verse 43. When the unclean spirit had gone out of a person, it passes through waterless places, seeking rest, but it finds none. Then it will say, I'll return to my house from which I came. When it comes, it will find the house empty, swept, and put in order. And then it goes and brings with it 7 other spirits more evil than itself, and they enter and dwell there. And the last day of the person is worse than the first. So also will it be with this evil generation. Okay, so he makes this parable in which someone, either a spirit has left or he's been cast out, and the man just kind of cleans house. He makes sure everything's in his part. But he doesn't put anything in. It's empty. There's nothing there. He's living a very apathetic lifestyle. We're very complacent. And so after a little while, the spirit comes back to him, and then he takes 7 other spirits that are more evil than himself, and they go back to the same deplorable state, actually a worse state than they were beforehand. And what Jesus is making an analogy here is the Jews at one point in their history had trouble with idolatry. Idolatry was rampant throughout their nation, and just generation after generation would have a problem with that. Well, after they get taken to Babylon and they come back, they don't have any more trouble with idolatry anymore. They make sure that they are staying on the right path. They've learned their lesson. But what has replaced it? Because they didn't replace it with God and knowing him and growing their relationship with him. Instead, what has replaced it is hypocrisy and indifference and apathy and all these other things. And they're worse than the first, because the first, it's easier to see that you are not following the right God. The second one is you think you're doing the right thing and you can't, but you're not, and you can't see it. And that's why it's worse than the first, because you can't change it. And it goes to show you that when you get set free from sin or from whatever is clinging to your life, you have to make efforts to replace it, to be the kind of person that you need to be. It's not enough just to leave your past life behind. You have to fill it with something, because, and I've seen this so many times, and especially newer Christians, where we work with them and we teach them, and they start making corrections in their life. They leave some of the friends that maybe had negative influence on them. They stopped going to the clubhouse on Sunday mornings. They start going to the bar on Friday nights. And what you find is they left all their friends. But if they don't make new friends and new relationships and have new goals for their life, it's only going to last a couple of months before they start going back to those old habits. And so that's what us as a congregation needs to be there, and invite them to places on Friday nights, and invite them over for Sunday lunch, and all these different things in order to help them build those relationships and fill that void. And so the evil doesn't come back in. And that's where we can help. And so we need to make sure when we get a habit or a sin or something in our life, we replace it so we don't go back to something that's worse than it was. And then he follows this. So this is kind of an analogy for how the Jewish people were. And he's comparing it to what what people have thought of him, and they want to sign, but they really don't want to sign, and that you can see their bad fruit from the words that they say and the things that they do, and you can see that they supposedly had gotten the spirit out, but it has come back, and they're actually worse than they were before. And then we have this brief interaction with his mother and his brothers. Verse 46, while he was speaking to the people, behold, his mother and his brothers stood outside, asking to speak to him. But he replied to the man who told him, who is my mother and who are my brothers? And stretching out his hand towards his disciples, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. So this is again kind of a response to him. It's not directly said, but you compare it to John 7 verse 5 and Mark 3:21. His brothers certainly did not believe him, and his mother and his brothers seemed to at one point try to get him away. They thought he was out of his mind, that he was kind of a lunatic, and so they tried to get him away from everyone else. And so this was his own response. It's bad enough to have the Pharisees and the religious leaders saying they don't believe in you and telling and spreading gossip and spreading smearing campaigns all over you, much less having your own flesh and blood to not believe in you. And that's what's happening here. Even his own mother and his own brothers did not believe that he was who he said he was. And so he says basically is who are my mother and brothers, sisters? Those who do the will of my Father. That's who are my brother and my sisters and my mother. It's the ones who do the will of my Father. And what he's saying here is obedience is better than blood, which is totally contrary to everything the Jews thought of. Because if you ask the Pharisees, if you ask the Jews, how do you know you're in right relationship with God? They would say, because I am a son of Abraham, because Abraham is my father, because I was born into the right family, because I have the blood I should have. And Jesus is saying that's not good enough. It's not good enough just to have the right blood. It's not good enough, as we've seen earlier, to follow all these customs and things that were thought to keep you safe. No, what God expects, what I expect, is for you to do the will of him who sent me, the Father that is in heaven, God. He wants obedience rather than blood, and that's what he wants. And so it's a call to obedience, that if you want to be part of Jesus's family, you obey the Father and you obey him and everything we've talked about so far. This is going to lead right into the parable of the sower. I mean, even the next words in it are the same day Jesus went out into the house and sat beside the sea. So right after this, he goes directly into the sower parable, which we'll talk about Sunday. So this goes right into it, and he's going to, so everything that we talked about, and I encourage you for Sunday before we get there to read chapters 11 through chapter 12, and really get that in your background, because we're going to see a lot of similarities to what he teaches going back to what is happening in his life, happening around him, and how Matthew constructs this story. So make sure you read those couple of chapters so that you'll see those things. I think next time we're going to look at the parable of sower and the parable of sower explained, and then we'll get into the rest of the kingdom parables. There's several: parable of mustard seed, parable of the hidden treasure, parable of great pearl, parable of the net. Like, there's a lot of parables talking about the kingdom, talking about who responds to the kingdom, who do the will of him who sent me. The people who respond will be blessed. All these kinds of things. So remember all these stories, and we'll get into it Sunday. I hope that this has been encouraging to you. It's good to know that it's good to remember that we need to always strive for the truth and not rely on just name alone. Maybe not blood is what we rely on, but maybe because we feel like we go to the right church. Oh, I go to a Church of Christ, that means I'm safe. not caring that your own actions may not reflect what God told you to do. And what we need to do in our lives is reflect in our lives and our actions and what we say to reflect what Jesus taught us to be. And if that is not a reflection, if we are not the mirror image of Jesus, then we have work to do, and we need to make sure that we are. Because if we're not, just being a part of the Church of Christ is not going to save you. You need the obedience portion as well. So hope that was good for you. It definitely encouraged me to be better and study the Gospel of Matthew. Hope you have a good day, and everything goes well with you.